There is a moment, and if you've owned a dog long enough, you've lived it, where your animal, your companion, this creature you've shared your home and your bed and your life with, does something that stops you completely. Not because it's dangerous, not because it's strange in any alarming way, but because for a split second, you find yourself asking a question you've never seriously considered before. What exactly is going on inside that mind? And somehow, humping, that embarrassing, awkward, seemingly ridiculous behavior that most owners laugh off or quietly redirect, turns out to be one of the most revealing windows into the inner world of dogs that science has ever found. Because what researchers have discovered when they actually study this behavior isn't what anyone expected, and the deeper they looked, the stranger and more fascinating the picture became. So let's go there. Let's actually investigate this. Because almost everything you think you know about why dogs hump is probably incomplete, and some of it may be completely wrong. The first assumption almost everyone makes is the obvious one. It's sexual. It's about reproduction. And certainly in intact males, hormones play a significant role, particularly testosterone, which rises sharply after puberty and can intensify this kind of behavior dramatically. Early studies from the mid-20th century largely reinforced this interpretation. Humping is categorized as a reproductive behavior, filed away, explained, and scientists moved on. But then something inconvenient kept happening in the data. Spayed females hump. Neutered males, animals with dramatically reduced testosterone, continue humping years after the procedure.
If this is purely a sexual behavior, the science has a problem. And this is where the investigation gets genuinely interesting. When ethologists, scientists who study animal behavior in natural contexts, began examining humping with fresh eyes, they started noticing patterns that the simple hormonal explanation couldn't account for. The behavior, it turns out, doesn't occur randomly. It tends to cluster around specific emotional states, around particular social situations, around moments of elevated internal tension that, when you understand what's actually happening neurologically, begin to make a completely different kind of sense. Here is something worth pausing on. The dog's nervous system, like ours, exists in a constant negotiation between arousal and regulation, between activation and calm. When something triggers excitement, a guest arriving, a game that becomes too intense, a social interaction that generates uncertainty, the body floods with neurochemical activity. Heart rate increases, cortisol and adrenaline rise. The animal system is in the most literal sense overloaded. And bodies, both human and canine, need ways to discharge that load. Researchers studying stress behaviors in dogs have identified humping as what some call a displacement activity, a behavior that emerges not from a specific desire, but from internal overflow. Think of it as a pressure valve. In many cases, what you're witnessing is a nervous system attempting to regulate itself through physical action. If you've ever watched someone tap their foot during a stressful meeting, or seen a child spin in circles when they can't contain excitement, you've seen the human version of this same principle. The form is completely different. The underlying mechanism is remarkably similar. But here is where I need to be careful, because this is a place where the science becomes genuinely complicated, because humping isn't always a stress response, and this is where the story refuses to stay simple. Because sometimes, and behaviorists are increasingly convinced of this, humping is social. It is, in the vocabulary of dogs, a way of exploring or asserting something about a relationship, not dominance in the old reductive sense that dominated animal behavior research for decades. The idea of rigid pack hierarchies has been substantially revised by modern ethologists, particularly following more careful observation of wolves in natural family groups rather than artificial captive settings. But something related, something about status, about confidence, about where an animal perceives itself within a social dynamic. When a dog humps another dog during play, what researchers often observe is not aggression, not dominance in any traditional sense, but a kind of social testing, a negotiation. The other dog's response, whether it tolerates the behavior, moves away, or signals discomfort, tells both animals something about the texture of their relationship. In some cases, the dog being humped will hump back. In others, one animal defers. The behavior becomes a sentence in a conversation that most humans.
And when the object of that behavior is a human being, this is where it gets genuinely strange. Dogs have lived alongside humans for somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years. The precise timeline remains debated. And in that extraordinary span of coevolution, something unprecedented happened. Dogs didn't merely adapt to living near humans. They appear to have evolved specific cognitive and emotional capacities oriented toward us. Research from the Clever Dog Lab in Vienna and from Brian Hare's group at Duke has consistently shown that dogs interpret human social cues, pointing, gaze, emotional expression, in ways that even our closest primate relatives often cannot. Dogs don't think we're dogs, but they appear to have incorporated us into their social world so completely that many of the behaviors they use with other dogs get transferred, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes inappropriately, onto us. So when a dog humps its owner, it may be expressing something genuinely social, not sexual, not purely stress-driven, but relational, a kind of displaced social communication aimed at the being that matters most in its world. Whether that's excitement seeking an outlet, a bid for attention, a response to emotional overstimulation, or something more nuanced about the relationship itself, the honest answer is that it often depends on the individual animal, the context, and the history between dog and owner in ways that a single explanation simply cannot capture. And this is the part that most YouTube videos skip over, because the honest scientific position is not one clean answer. It's several overlapping possibilities, varying by dog, by moment, by relationship.
What we do know, with reasonable confidence, is that humping, across all contexts, tends to increase in animals experiencing high arousal states, whether positive or negative. Dogs that hump frequently in social situations are often dogs whose arousal regulation systems are, for whatever reason, less well calibrated. This can be genetic. It can be early environment. It can be learned, because if a dog humps and receives a dramatic reaction, even a negative one, that reaction is attention, and attention from a human is one of the most powerful reinforcers in the canine universe. There is something almost poignant about that when you sit with it. A dog performing a behavior that confuses or embarrasses its owner, not because of some deep dysfunction, but because at some earlier moment, a human responded in a way that the dog's brain logged as meaningful, and so the loop continues. The solution, from a behavioral science perspective, is neither punishment nor elaborate explanation. It is simply and consistently the removal of reinforcement combined with the creation of an alternative behavior that achieves a similar regulatory function. Redirection to physical exercise, to structured play, to anything that gives the nervous system a different pathway for discharging what it needs to discharge. But I think what stays with me, what I find myself returning to after all of this, is not the practical question of how to stop the behavior. It's the deeper question of what it reveals. Because here is a creature that has spent millennia adapting to us.
And yet, in moments of overload, in moments when the social world becomes too much to process, it falls back on behaviors so ancient, so embedded in the biological inheritance it shares with wolves and wild ancestors, that hormones and instinct briefly override all of that extraordinary relational sophistication. It's as though two timescales of evolution are running simultaneously inside the same animal, the ancient and the intimate, the wild and the domestic. And sometimes, in the most awkward and unexpected moments, those two timescales collide. And maybe that's not so different from us, after all. We like to think of our own strangest impulses as aberrations, but they're often just older layers of the nervous system doing what older layers of nervous systems do, seeking relief, seeking connection, seeking some form of regulation in a world that is consistently, relentlessly more complex than our biology was originally designed to handle. Perhaps the dog isn't so strange. Perhaps in this moment it's simply being honest, in a way we've mostly learned to hide. And if that thought makes you look at your dog a little differently, if it makes the behaviors seem less absurd and more, in some strange way, familiar, then maybe we've arrived somewhere worth being. What else have we been too quick to explain away?